So thank you so much for joining me because I have been a long-time fan, and so why I'll let you introduce yourself to people and sort of tell them who you are and what you're about, and then we'll sort of dive in.
Okay, I go by KibblesTasty online or Kibbles. I am a D&D homebrew content creator. I've been doing it for about 8 years. It kind of started as a hobby. I mostly started posting on Reddit, on the Unearthed Arcana subreddit, and eventually branched into, publishing books. I am now publishing my third book, um, and that's currently live on Kickstarter right now. I started with the inventor, and that's what I mostly do is I make classes for the game. I do make a lot of subclasses, but I think the classes are what I'm typically more known for. I also make some, systems for the game. I made a crafting system, stuff like that, a battle system, and now I'm making an airship system. That's what the new book is. So that's, pretty much all there is to tell.
And I mean, one of the things I've sort of learned over the years of seeing your stuff is that it's very well balanced. So can you talk about sort of the balancing process? Because lots of
Right.
homebrew runs into problems of like too powerful or too useless.
One of the things that I note when people bring this up about my homebrew tending to be more balanced than you can sometimes see is that I'm primarily a DM, so there's no incentive for me to make the homebrew too strong because then I got to deal with it, right? I'm dealing with this from the DM side of the screen. So I prefer that the content is reasonable to start with because I'm the one that has to, run the monsters against it. I'm not trying to defeat the players or anything, but I want, an encounter I can reasonably balance. I want the players to all be roughly the same strength, that kind of thing.
And you'd have
I
such a
don't,
hard time telling a player they couldn't run something
yeah,
from your own
I have a
materials.
hard rule of I allow everything I write. So that's kind of the limitation I put on myself. And I have bent that in modern times when I'm writing like conversions for the new edition, stuff like that. We can get that later.
Yep.
But, so I also play the game a lot. I've talked to some homebrewers that play, occasionally, but, I play about 3 games a week to 2 games a week.
That's a
And then I
lot.
play just on top of that. So, I have a lot of exposure to seeing my content in action, just seeing the game in action. So,
And I suppose at times you must have to adjust it when you see something and you're like, this is
right,
not working out.
one thing is like my content doesn't, nowadays it probably magically comes out more balanced. But like, if you saw the point 0.1 version of my first creation, it's probably less balanced. But my classes typically exist in some form for about a year before they get into a book, at least. So they go through a pretty long cycle. Summoner's been out for about 2 years now before it's going to go into a book, and Paragon will be about exactly a year before it gets printed into the new book. So I typically seen it in dozens of games, and at this point, I have been working on this for 8 years. So, I at this point I can kind of one shot, balance things a little bit better where, I have a pretty good grasp of what the number ranges are, what you can kind of get away with. Because, one thing about my content is it tends to be what I call crunchier. There's a lot more
Yep.
moving parts to it. So looking at it, it can be a bit more intimidating. But, once you kind of see through where does this interact with the game? That's what you got to worry about. You don't need to care about the word count, how many pages it is. You need to care about when it functions with the game. What is the DM seeing when I play this class? And that's what I really focus on is how does this interact with the game, and what does this look like when you're actually using it at the table? I don't mind if it takes the player, more time to make their character because that's something they opt into. But
Right.
I don't want your player option to be everyone else's problem at the table.
Yeah, I find that with I mean, I'm one of the DMs who sort of tends to restrict flying races just because of that problem. it's really easy for the player to just be like, all right, I'm going to take this flying thing, but now I, as the DM, have to make every encounter like, does this work with a flying PC? And so I appreciate that when you're not dumping work into my lap, because as a sort of forever DM myself, you end up with you have a lot of more work to do than the average player. So
yeah, flying races is one of those things where I also don't typically allow them. And I understand when people say, the DM can balance around them. And I'm like, yes, I can balance around them. I don't want to, though.
Yeah.
Anytime the DM is having to make a carve out to make one player's stuff work, that's just adding to the DM's workload. And the DM already has the most time intensive job at the table. My job is to not give him more problems.
It's actually one of the things I use to evaluate homebrew, which is part of why sort of your stuff tends to pass muster more than others, is how much is this going to ruin my day? Because I remember a character who had a thing, they had a homebrew power that allowed them to do like phase shifts. And suddenly I realized midway through that like every door suddenly stopped being a thing. And I had to go, okay, we got to put a limit on that. It can't be all the time. It's got to be capped. And, these kinds of things, the more headaches you have for the DM, because they're thinking, how do I make a barrier now that this person can't get through? Without doing like video game fences.
I had that, because I do have a option that, is based around teleporting to an extent. And I know it's like a problem, right? You can't just have level 1 teleporting be unrestricted. So you got to start with like, it can go 5 feet. It can't go through walls. You put all these gates and stuff around the feature, and then you slowly ease those out as things like, dimension door and all sorts of nonsense become available naturally. You can start, undoing those shackles. Like we're talking about flying races earlier. I don't allow flying races. I don't give flying features to low level. But once you get to like 9th, 13th level, I just accept that ship has probably sailed, right? We're probably, not worrying too much about being ground bound anymore. And that's the area where I start my giving, giving long-term flying abilities, stuff like that.
No, that makes sense. Is how long have you been playing role-playing games? I assume probably starting with D&D. Most folks do, but sort of what's the time frame?
I would say that I have a high familiarity with 3.5 Pathfinder. But I only started homebrewing stuff in 5e, and I play a lot more. I played a lot more 5e than previous editions. I would have described myself as a more casual dabbler of previous editions, where once we got to 5e, I started playing a lot more. I've played a bunch of RPGs over the years, various World of Darkness, all sorts of games like that. 5e, D&D is definitely the central locus of what I play. And, 5e is when I would say I really got into, I didn't usually play weekly before 5e, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I found it to be a very easy system for a lot of that stuff. And I played 2e heavily and then kind of wandered away, and 5e was what brought me back. So, although now I kind of dabble with a whole bunch of things, so various other things. Just, you mentioned flying, so I think that's a good tie-in for your latest Kickstarter project there, which is Airships. And I thought that was, I've had nothing but problems trying to run airships and even just regular ships before, because you just run into things like, okay, somebody fireballs the boat, what happens after that?
Right.
So I'm very interested in this. Yeah.
My new book is Kibble's Compendium of Airships and Artifacts. That's how I start all my books, Kibble's Compendium. We can get into why they're named that later, but how I came to that theme, it just kind of looking for, I have a bunch of class content that I'm going to post either way, right? This is the stuff that I've, write over the years. And then I'm looking for, okay, so I need to bundle this into a book. What are the additional mechanics I want for that book? Because each book, I want it to not just be a bundle of classes. I want there to be at least 1 or 2 good systems in there as well. And airships is one of those kind of things where I feel like they work really well for a certain kind of campaign. because they're this mobile base thing. Players like bases, but the problem is bases are stuck there, right? And usually parties move around. And ships can be great for that. Then you got to do a sea-based campaign. And airships are just cool. Players like airships. If you give players the chance to get an airship, they're probably going to take it. That just sparks their imagination. And then it also has a lot of like infrastructure around it that makes sense to have. Like one of the things we're doing with the Kickstarter, right, is battle maps for your airships, right?
Yeah.
Because that might be the kind of asset that's a bit harder to find if you're trying to find battle maps. There's definitely some out there that are good. If I can give you a roster of 20 more battle maps for enemy airships that are a bit more unique and different, and then like an asset pack for player airships, you can kind of construct and tinker with them. That's the kind of stuff that is good in a Kickstarter because I'm not just going to start funding battle maps on my own time, but as part of a Kickstarter, I can bring that up. So.
And visual stuff tends to help with a Kickstarter too. Like just here, buy these pages of text.
And my first book had the crafting system, so I can kind of expand that crafting system into building and upgrading airships because one of the struggles that 5e tends to have is it doesn't have great gold sinks. You earn gold, but there's not a lot of default rules of what to do with that gold. But giving you an airship, suddenly you have an endless path of upgrade and tinkering that the players will be very invested in. They want to sink all their gold into their baby. And it's a lot of stuff that they can just kind of they'll want to bolt on all sorts of new engines and upgraded gizmos and gadgets. And then one thing you mentioned is the fireballing of airships. One of the problems I have with airship combat, right, is that like the barbarian isn't doing a lot until the enemy airship gets close, right? Because they want to jump over and start smashing stuff on it. So one of the things the book has is like airship roles. So in addition to your class, you each have kind of like a subspecialization of actions you can take on the airship that don't depend on your class. So you can cast fireball on the enemy airship, but that's not that much more effective than firing your airship weapons at the enemy airship. So you can kind of, some people can serve as their own artillery, though it's going to be usually pretty wasteful because I don't really want to encourage that. I do want to allow it because players are just going to naturally want to do it. But
why are you burning your spell when you can fire the cannons?
Exactly, and you have these special weapons to engage with these airships. And a lot of them are going to end in boarding actions, right? Even, because people are playing D&D, they want to play their characters. That's something I learned with the battle system is that it's great to run this epic battle, but you want to zoom in on the players and let them fight it out in many of the cases. Like sometimes it's fine if you just blow their airship up and the encounter's over, right? We don't need to, fight every group of goblin pirates in their airship or something. But, a lot of times you want to zoom in and board them. So it's kind of a balance between giving them ways to engage at the range side and making that feel meaningful, but also pretty quick. And then, making it so you can get up close and personal and board their ship and take their stuff, which is, the core of D&D adventuring.
Yeah, we hit things, we take their stuff. It's
right.
Kind of the central loop.
With your weapons, their airship goes falling out of the sky and blows up, and you don't get their stuff.
I like the idea of making sure that like the barbarian or the rogue or something has something to do, and that they're not just sitting there like watching the wizard and the ranger like shooting arrows and spells going, man, it'd be nice if I could do any of that. So this is the kind of thinking that I think changes a game changes a system from this is a really fun thing to this is one of those things that just kind of bombs at the table. So I'm glad to hear that that kind of thinking is going into it. I'm curious, like, what is the process of running a Kickstarter? Because I'm sure lots of people out there have ideas. I've got ideas. What's it like trying to actually turn those into, a product and I guess finally at the end of the day, a profit? But, what was that process like? What's sort of the economics, the hassles?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack here. This can be, a shorter or longer answer as you want. So, the first thing you have to do is define your scope and goal, right? you can run a successful Kickstarter that raises $4,000, $5,000 if you're doing, print on demand, PDF delivery kind of stuff. And I know people that, that's their bread and butter, right? They run like, 4 or 5 Kickstarters a year. Each one raises 10K. That's great, but you can't be doing, production print runs on that kind of margin, So
Right.
what you'll be seeing is, print on demand is way more convenient, way easier. There's almost no chance of you, the creator, losing money, right? Because you don't pay much up front.
You haven't got 10,000 books. You need to sell at
So,
least
for
9,000
people
of.
that are
Yeah.
in the entry steps of it, I would heavily consider print on demand, or PDF delivery. But the flip side of that is print on demand is generally not as great a quality, and the price point per book is a lot worse. The backers paying a lot more for a lower quality book with print on demand.
Right.
And it's gotten a little bit better, but that's kind of just the reality of it. So the first thing is you kind of have to scope out what your expected target is. And you have to be a little bit realistic here because, if you don't have a bunch of pre-launch followers, if you don't have mailing lists, if you don't have Discords, you're probably not going to raise more than a couple $1,000s. I kind of would say I got lucky because the first Kickstarter I went into, I had a pretty big audience from my, I've been publishing stuff online for about 3 years at that point. But I didn't know a lot about, what this was going to cost me. And so that first one raised like 190K or something. So I had a large parachute to figure those problems out. But I would say, from my perspective, I would not do a production run for under 40, 50K. That's the kind of area where you're very likely to be able to break even as long as, you're being reasonable.
Right.
Sorry. From there, when you start out, a lot of people are publishing under, fan content policy to use different, Wizards of the Coast art. You're going to have to transition to getting all your own art. So that can be pretty expensive. You can cut corners. You can use stock art, stuff like that. And then, so the kind of the pre steps to a Kickstarter are to get an audience. And based on that audience size, then you kind of scale the expectations of what your Kickstarter will be. Then once you're getting into doing an offset print run, which is what they call the production print runs, that's where, they print out, thousands of books at once. And,
Right.
some people I don't think understand how cheap those books are. Each book I print, they can cost me like, $6 to $10, right? To print these nice hardcover books. But to get that price, you have to be printing 5 to 10,000 of these books. And if you can't sell those books, you pay for those books before they go anywhere, which is why Kickstarter is nice because it's essentially a giant pile of pre-orders. And then a lot of people will tell you, you want to raise the average pledge in your Kickstarter as high as possible. Now, I don't really do that. I target an average pledge of $60, which is not the correct way to do it. You really want to be in the $150 range, but to me, it's a bit crazy, but that's kind of what Kickstarter culture is. Kickstarter tends to draw people that want the toy box. And when you get to those higher price points, you can afford to push ads a lot more. That's another thing I think that not everyone grasps about Kickstarter is that, ads are pretty important. Like none of us like ads. Ads are, anyone you talk to will say ads are bad. And I would say the same thing.
But they support this channel. They help
But the reality is
get
no
people's
one knows
attention.
about your stuff unless, they found some way to tell them.
Yeah.
So you'll need, a combination of an ad plan, a platform. The bigger your mailing list, the bigger your Discord, the bigger your YouTube channel, all these things kind of snowball into how good your Kickstarter is going to do. And then, of course, there's, being topical, right? 5e is a good Kickstarter subject, but it's not nearly as good as it was 3 years ago.
Right.
Being one of the first people to hit up, something that's like, during a couple of years ago, there was a great time to be kickstarting a new TTRPG, right? Because people were looking for new options, even if not all those are going to end up getting played. There was a lot of enthusiasm about the subject, so you kind of want something that draws enthusiasm. You want an audience, you want a marketing plan, and then production side thing, right? You have three kind of options, right? Once you go past print on demand, right? Print on demand prints locally to where the users are. Most big print on demand companies, they print in UK, EU, sometimes Canada, almost always US, sometimes Australia. So they kind of handle the distribution side of things as well sometimes. But when you're doing a big production run, right, those tend to print only either in China or Eastern Europe. You can print in the US if you have a really big run and a really high margin, but it's going to be a lot more challenging. But then you've got to account for you have books in China or books in Eastern Europe, and there's no magic way to get those to where you want them. That's was kind of the first shock for me when I ran my first Kickstarter is I have, 8,000 books sitting in a factory in China, and there's no button to click to just send those books to the warehouse and, where I want them. So, I have distribution partners now, I have fulfillment partners, and, these people are all going to show up, but they're all going to show up the bigger your Kickstarter does, and they're all going to, need a piece of the money. So your expenses add up pretty quick. Most of them, couple percentage points here and there, it can be pretty reasonable to engage these services. Like for fulfillment in the US, I use a company called Flying Cloud, and they do my US and Canada orders right now. For Australia, I have I guess for Australia, New Zealand, UK, and EU, I work with Games Quest, and Games Quest works with Let's Play Games in Australia. So I have 3 warehouses for my current books, which is Australia, US, and UK. And now I could do more warehouses, but each warehouse has base costs associated with it. So you have like a threshold for each region of how much you need traffic in that region versus the shipping cost of that region. So there's basically infinite steps of, I guess, what to step back here. There's basically infinite steps of complexity, right? You can start on the easy side, which is here's a print on demand code. Just click this button, you get your book. And then the bigger your Kickstarter goes, the more kind of fulfillment steps you have to get higher and higher efficiency on each step.
And margins being what they are, all of these things get to be a headache. And if they go wrong, like we've seen a lot of Kickstarters in the past where somebody has big ambitions and then they realize I'm making negative money per sale.
Yeah, and that's why I'd really recommend people strongly consider print on demand, because it's way safer, right? You struggle to mess up with print on demand. I mean, you might not make a lot of money, and your users are, your backers are paying more per book, but you're a lot safer. One of the, on my first Kickstarter, I had to cancel an add-on because I did the math and realized that one of the things I said I would make a card pack of was going to be like 300 cards. And, I could afford to print that. But what I realized I couldn't afford to do is ship that, because a pack of 300 cards, the shipping cost would be like 3 times the entire book for, each product that shipped with that. So I had to go to backers and say, this is not going to be a reward because, I did the math wrong, because I didn't account for shipping of, how heavy the playing cards are when you have 300 of them.
You add a half ounce to every package, and suddenly it's a big deal.
Yeah, I keep my Kickstarter looks complicated. If you go over there, you'll see the legendary bundle with all this stuff. What you'll realize is that everything I make is printed on paper or cardboard. I don't do dice. I don't do minis. Everything I do kind of squishes flat and is pretty durable. So that kind of heavily simplifies my shipping. I think for most of the Kickstarters you see that lose money, right? Minis are a big one, right? Because Not only are they complicated, they're very prone to breakage and shipping. They need a box and stuff. As soon as you get into plastic, your life's getting more complicated. And then you always have to budget out large margins because costs just come screaming out of nowhere frequently. With the last Kickstarter, I had a very large unexpected cost with the tariffs and customs fees. You can't account for that, but even stuff like shipping, right? It doesn't stay static. Shipping changes, and it can cost twice as much one day to ship from China to the U.S. or to Europe as the next, right? This fluctuates a lot more than you might think. And when you have Kickstarter saying, or backers saying, "Where's my book? Where's my book?" You can't just leave it in the harbor. So you start with a really good margin, right? As I was saying, these books, you have $40 of wiggle room, let's say, on these books. But then you got to get got to pay all the port fees, you got to pay any tariffs, you got to pay the shipping. They got to pay picking and packing, right? Because unless you're doing these in your garage, you're paying someone in a warehouse to stuff them in envelopes. So be very conservative on margins. One of the things that I always tell people with my Kickstarters is I don't live off the money I make on the Kickstarter until all the books are shipped, right? So, one of the ways people run out of money on a Kickstarter, right, is they pay their salary out of Kickstarter. I don't take a salary until the books are fully complete, and then I collect the remainder. So until I have the full amount to work with, and if anything happens, that comes out of basically my portion of it. But not everyone's going to have that luxury because some people, if this is their job, right, they got to pay rent and food and stuff.
Yeah.
So it can be tricky.
I feel like that's another danger people make, is that they try to make the switch to "this is my job" too soon.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when you get somebody who starts a Kickstarter for like a board game, it suddenly hits in a way that they weren't expecting, and they're like, "I can quit my day job. I've got like $200,000 in the bank." It's like, it's not your money yet.
Yeah, and I mean, especially for people that aren't familiar with being self-employed, being self-employed generally costs more money, right? You suddenly are on your hook for your health insurance, depending on where you live. Taxes
Not
are
so
higher
much here, but yeah.
And taxes are another big one for Kickstarters, right? If you're not expecting it, the tax bill after a Kickstarter is, for people that are used to like their salary from a work, just taking the taxes out before they kind of see it. Suddenly you're on the hook for paying those taxes at the end of the year. And if you didn't, save up enough money to cover that, that's another hurdle.
Yeah, I get that a little bit with YouTube, because YouTube just pays pays you whatever. And then the Canadian government is like, "Where's our cut at the end of the year?" And if you haven't planned for it, that's a rough year, or a rough moment.
I get some people, especially this kind of year, this time of year, is saying, "Oh, I'll back your Kickstarter and I get my tax refund back." And I'm like, "Oh, tax refunds! I remember that as a distant memory. I don't have those anymore. Now I owe a bunch of taxes."
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. It's but these are all good considerations, because I see lots of people online who are like, "I'm gonna," and they've got big dreams. Like they see $500,000 Kickstarters or whatever, and they're like, "Yeah, that's gonna be me." And maybe they don't realize just how much work and hassle and how much of a secondary skill set it is. Because
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Is people. I would call my job, game designer or writer or something, but really my job is, production manager, book company for that, every other year for half the year. Because like I was talking about earlier, with I had to learn how to ship books around the world with international logistics stuff, and like that's not a skill you come built in with. I mean, maybe some people do, but there's a lot of stuff, and like you can outsource all of these things to an extent, but the more you're relying on partners, the more cost there are, and you can't have the buck stop with your partners in this industry, because like when something unexpected, like when the tariffs happened, some of my shipping partners just said, "We don't know," right? So like it's not their problem at the end of the day to solve this problem. And while, they might give you advice, you have to
At
be
the
the
end of the
one
day,
to
it's
step
your
in and deal
problem.
with it. You have to be on the phone with a warehouse in Baltimore trying to figure out how you're going to get books out of customs, right? That's just going to be the reality of what you're doing sometimes.
And sometimes that just means showing up with a check and being like, all right, give me my books, please.
Well, frequently that's part of the solution, yes.
And, if you haven't got room in your budget for it, it's...
Yeah, I mean, I saw a lot of Kickstarters during the various, we've had shipping shock after shipping shock. And, I've seen more than one Kickstarter where they say, well, our books are locked up in, this warehouse because we can't pay this fee or that fee. And, you really never want to be in the position of going to your backers and asking for more money because you're probably already behind schedule. They're probably not super thrilled. As much as possible, you want to just trudge through all these steps. So that's, why I really encourage just holding as much of the money as possible until things are, shipped through. And, once you ship through, right, you'll probably have overstock. You get to sell. You can, can start recouping that money back. I've made a good amount of money selling the excess stock from the last Kickstarter. So, it's not all doom and gloom, but you have to be careful, and it's, a very budget managing business.
Especially because it's also a very reputation heavy business for Kickstarter. If you have one Kickstarter where all of your people get burned, do not expect there to be a line for your next Kickstarter.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, you've got an excellent reputation. I haven't heard anybody complain like, Kibbles burned me or anything, but I think we've all seen the spectacular crash and burns.
I will own up to all of my Kickstarters have run long, I'd say. They've taken longer to deliver than I estimated. And, this time I've tried to break in more schedule. But I'm upfront that I do not guarantee that you will get the book on the date the Kickstarter says. Because, if we have another pandemic, another shipping shock, another whatever, there's a lot of things that will stop that from happening. And one of those things is I might just be slow. But what I do guarantee is eventually you will get your book. Because, as long as the Kickstarter has raised more than the minimum amount that I need to make the book, right, I'm the one that wants to get you the book the most because I said I don't pay myself until I get you the book. So I have a strong motivation to get you that book as fast as possible.
Yeah, I never assume that anything on Kickstarter is coming on time. That's just my kind of... I don't think I've ever ordered anything on Kickstarter that arrived on the schedule that like Kickstarter envisions. There's always it's Kickstarter, and I've had pretty good luck with it.
I had a friend who was ahead of schedule, and I was like, "This is impossible. You can't be ahead of schedule." And then the printer messed up their entire print run of books, and they had to reprint everything from scratch. And I was like, "Well, this was the Kickstarter gods just zapping you." It's deeply unfortunate, but yeah, I would say, you just can't. There's so many moving parts in this that I'll have to go in some sort of sequential order, and you almost always lose time and almost never gain time. So,
have you ever gotten any interest or reaching out from like Wizards of the Coast or anything like that? If you can say.
So, I can talk about that. So I did hear from them about wanting to put the last book on D&D Beyond. I will not go into too much depth. I'll say it generally didn't work out. D&D Beyond is kind of their main interaction with third parties right now, and they've been loading more and more third parties on, and I think that's a good thing. I don't have only nice things to say about D&D Beyond, but I do think that putting more third-party content on there is good, both for Wizards of the Coast and for the third parties. My impression is that new classes were very challenging for them to implement on that platform, and they were specifically only interested in 2024 content, which is now 5.5.
Right.
And at the time, I wasn't super interested in converting my old classes to 2024, and there were significant challenges on getting third-party classes, especially ones like mine that have a lot of moving parts, onto their platform. So I know that they know I exist for the better or the worse. um, but I'm on the kind of the smallest of the big scale. Like there's a lot of creators that are smaller than me that and then there's a lot of creators that are bigger than me. I'm kind of on the bigger end for just a bloke sitting here working on stuff. But
Right.
there's a lot of third-party companies that are much bigger and much better equipped to kind of do those negotiations and stuff.
Yeah, I suppose that's got to be something when it's like, all right, let's have a negotiation, and they're like, okay, who's your representative? And it's like,
What I will generally say, and I obviously can't speak for them. My I'd say if you raise, $1 million in Kickstarter, you'll probably hear from them about, something. If you raise less than that, maybe.
I mean, I just think of it in the sense that like the existence of small creators is one of the things that actually makes D&D like a really attractive format. Because if I want to play something like, just, if I grab like Vampire or something, there's a lot less sort of third-party content, and you could burn, like, there's no way for the big companies to make content as fast or as sort of nimbly as the average person does.
And third-party content also has a large advantage of it can afford to specialize a lot more. Like, a lot of the stuff I make would not necessarily be good Wizard of the Coast content because they're not made for literally everyone that plays the game.
Right.
A lot of it's kind of opt-in kind of content. Like I say, I tend to focus on a bit more crunchy, a bit more mechanical things to expand the game for people that want that kind of stuff. But I accept that I'm making stuff for a niche of the audience, because if any third party is marketing to 1% of the D&D audience, right? You're eating well, right? The audience is so big that you can afford to make the content for the people that want to play the kind of content you make.
Yeah.
And that kind of gives you just a depth of field that other games can't really have.
Well, and Wizards also has to have the thought that anything they put out is sort of official content, and then it becomes harder to gate out. Like, it's easy for me to say, okay, like the summoner is not not allowed at this table. It's a lot harder to say,
This is
like,
where we'll
I'm
get
not.
into some of my opinions on Wizard of the Coast content, and that I used to be an all official content all the time allowed.
Yeah.
That died with me several years ago at this point.
I mean, I've got a video on, I think I called it Lord of the Rings versus Mos Eisley Cantina, which is like Lord of the Rings. There are, you've got the human, you've got the elf, you've got the dwarf, you've got the halflings. That's your pool. And then Mos Eisley Cantina, and each of them is kind of distinctive and unique. But like the Mos Eisley Cantina, there's a whole bunch of different aliens that nobody really cares that what they are or whatever. Everybody just kind of talks to each other, and it's not really. And I kind of leaned into the Lord of the Rings style as opposed to the Mos Eisley Cantina, right? I want each thing to have a place, so I can't throw everything in. Yeah, there's tables I would absolutely be like, let's have an airship, and tables I would absolutely be like, no airships, please.
Yeah, I mean that's that. I definitely agree with that. And that's one of the. I actually had a blog post about this a while ago because it's a big thing I care about called modularity, where especially when Wizard of the Coast was first designing 5e, they were planning to make it a modular game, and I think that was a brilliant idea that I wish they stuck to. Because I like plugging in modules to the game, right? I want to have, one of the things they talked about during the development was in D&D Next was like the survival module. They were planning on coming out with a, hex crawl survival module for the game. And when people say, why is survival mechanics and exploration not a big pillar of 5e? It's because they literally never came out with the part of the game that was supposed to do that.
It's like, here's another package that we'll just never invent and never
Exactly.
make.
And I think, third party kind of stepped in to fill a lot of these things. Like, in my last post that I made the battle system. I don't use the battle system in most campaigns, but suddenly when the hobgoblin army is marching up on the, farmer's town, then I can go, oh, I have this module, I go grab it. I probably won't use the airship module in, 80% of my games. But when the players get an airship, I really want an airship module to go grab and put in there. Crafting. Some games have used no crafting at all. Other games, there's one dedicated crafter that really digs into the system. And it's great to be able to hand them a crafting module and say, this is what you can craft, rather than having to wing every time you come up with it. And this is I really like having the base game be somewhat streamlined, somewhat flexible, and then just having pieces you can plug into it to expand it for what makes sense for that particular campaign or even for that particular player.
No, I like that. I like that a lot because sometimes you get a player who wants to do something and you're just sitting there going like, okay, what? How? Like, you get a player who's like, I want to build a castle. It's like, okay, that's a fully reasonable thing for your character to want. I want to be there for your character doing this. I have no idea what I'm doing. Like, I have no idea how to do it. So it's great to have, resources where you can go and say, all right, here's the rules. So,
and I think that's part of the reason that 5e has been such fertile ground for third-party developers, is because it lends itself to that modular play, because the skeleton has a lot of gaps in it. And that's fine for the average game, but it gives you a lot of stuff to plug stuff into that framework that can, be really great for some games, but not all games need.
Yeah, I mean, Final Fantasy, Final Fantasy, what was 3 here, great with an airship, but like, I've been playing Sons of the Forest, and Sons of the Forest would not be good with an airship. It would be just an awful game. So, I don't know if you're familiar with that one, but
basically any campaign where you don't want them to skip the terrain bit, you don't want to give them an airship. But any campaign where you don't want to deal with the wilderness travel bits, an airship is great. But some campaigns never leave a city, right? The whole campaign takes place in one city. And that's a perfectly valid and normal way to play, and you probably don't need an airship. But when you need an airship, it's way easier to have a set of rules for it than be like, oh, it has 160 hit points and a damage threshold of blah, 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 just scrambling to come up with stuff.
And then you're finding all the mistakes, like, oh, right, the barbarian is sitting there and he's bored every time they're in the airship.
It goes real fast when the dragon just kills the airship, and now they're 500 feet in the sky.
It's like, okay, everybody dies except the wizard, who happened to have Featherfall memorized.
You really want some sort of crashing rules to make sure that they have a chance of surviving.
No, super impressed with all of that. So how long is the Kickstarter running?
So it is running until April 2nd. It started at March 3rd, April 2nd. It's about a month, the traditional kind of Kickstarter length. It is already fully funded. It's doing pretty well. I'm happy with it. It's definitely not going to compete with my last Kickstarter, but the market is very different. I was never expecting it to. So, I was worried about it. I'm not worried about it anymore, but the further it goes, the better.
No, that's, it's tough. It's a tough market, but saying, hey, this is, what is it, second, third? How many funded Kickstarters are you in? This will be
my third Kickstarter. The first one was about 5 years ago. The second one was a little under 3 years ago. And then this one is running now.
Not a lot of people can say, 3 fully funded Kickstarters on their resume. So it's a huge achievement there. Now, you said earlier there's a reason why Kibbles Compendium. I'm curious. I made a note of that because I was like...
I said there's a reason, not a good reason. So, when I started, this was not something that was my job, right? I was a software engineer previously. I was making stuff for my own games, and I decided, I'm going to go take this to Reddit, and I'm going to post this on Reddit. But I didn't have a Reddit account. I didn't post on Reddit at the time. So I went to Reddit and I, created an account, and, there's random names, and one of them was KibblesTasty with some numbers. And I was like, well, I like dogs. So I picked that name. I deleted the numbers off the end. And I was like, okay, I'll never think about this name again. And then I posted under that name, and then, 4 months later, going on a year later, suddenly a bunch of people are fans of KibblesTasty on Reddit. So you can't just change the name now.
Yeah,
Now
you're
I'm
stuck with
forever
it.
KibblesTasty, despite that being a strange name, you know. So at some point you just kind of lean into the fact that, okay, I'm KibblesTasty, and I'm just going to deal with that fact. So, you know, I stopped trying to give it like a cool epic fantasy name, because at the end of the day, it's a book by KibblesTasty. So we're just going to call it Kibble's Compendium. And so the first one was Kibble's Compendium of Crafting Creation. With, you know, I had a full alliteration. I figured, you know, you got to do something with the name. And then once you name the first book that, you know, the second book is naturally going to be Kibble's Compendium of something. So now each one has been Kibble's Compendium of Crafting Creation, Kibble's Compendium of Legends and Legacies, and then now Kibble's Compendium of Airships and Artifacts.
Nice. You could do worse. I know a guy who had the same sort of origin story for his name, but it was Suckboy Tony is what he got stuck with. So
Yeah, you know, KibblesTasty is a ridiculous name, but you know, it's A, somewhat unique, and B, easy to remember. And you know, C, people generally like dogs and cats. If you like either dogs or cats, you know, it makes it easy to make a fun logo for the name. I have a little logo that's a paladin doggo right now. One of the gimmicks of the Kickstarter is that I'm doing a contest of which sells more between the warlock cat or the paladin dog. And then I'll change my logo to, like, because I have stickers of each, right? I have a sticker of the paladin dog and I have a sticker of the cat warlock. And whichever sells more stickers, I'll change my logo to use that one for the year following Kickstarter.
I might have to go with the paladin dog, and I'll show you why. It's something from an online game I ran. It's just a little tiny clip, but
Yeah, so every April, on a certain day of April, the first one, I post animal, like I posted Oath of the Goodest Boy was the first one I did. And so I call it actual Kibbles content. Now, what makes sense for my name to be making? So I'll make, you know, the last one I did, the cat warlock, which was, you know, patron of the provider, and the joke was your patron was a human that feeds you. So you know, once a year I do these kind of silly, goofy pet-based classes. You know, it's a joke because I made this Oath of the Goodest Boy, which, you know, is, you know, a meme name for doggo, kind of,
yeah.
you know, internet nonsense. And suddenly I get people playing it, and I'm like, well, go ahead and play it if you want, but that's not really what it was designed for.
I didn't really realize that was a thing, or else I would have run it for. I did I do an Extra Life fundraiser each year, and so I think I did it for the Extra Life, but it was a little like one-shot adventure where the characters were all stuffed animals that were basically, some kid was like, I've lost my best friend, it was taken, and the stuffed animals kind of animate to go and rescue it. And that's where that little clip is from, is the best friend turns out to be the dog. And but yeah, the dog joins the fight, assuming that the players break in. So I totally should have been
Well,
like,
I
that
have
is a
just the
Goodest Boy
option for you
paladin.
next time.
I also wanted to ask a little bit about licensing, because I've had a bunch of stuff about licensing on this channel, talking about like Wizards kind of, how do I put this politely, crap the bed on the licensing with the whole
yeah.
and then you get the orc license that Paizo came up with, which I also don't like. But you release a lot of, like, you've got a lot of stuff on sort of the you know, what is it, the Kibbles reference document, which is just CC by.
Right.
So
So, you know,
yeah.
I'm a pretty big supporter of the Creative Commons license for D&D content. You know, I accept that not everyone can put their stuff under it for somewhat good reasons. But, you know, one of the things that I think that people get too wrapped up in is it's not super likely as a third party that people are going to steal your content successfully, right? Some of them are going to take your content, but your name being attached to the content is, you know, a significant amount of its worth.
Yeah.
So, you know, I've had people take my content, especially, you know, under the Creative Commons, they can do that. but it doesn't really impact my business much when they do, because people aren't really going to buy my content from an off-brand source. And some people say, well, what if Wizard of the Coast steals your content? Wizard of the Coast is extremely unlikely to take my content, because the reputational challenge of that is way bigger than any license challenge of that.
I mean, if they did, I'd be making a
And we
video
see what
going.
happens when they try to take it. That was called the OGL 1.2. It went terribly for them. So we don't probably. I think you've covered the OGL stuff in great depth, and that's fortunately watered under the bridge.
Yeah, I give them credit for moving away from it. You got to give credit where it's due.
Was called that because it was supposed to be my last book for 5th edition. Because that came out, that was coming out right as the OGL thing, and I was like, okay, well, this is where I leave this edition, and so I'm just going to post all of my content into the OGL. I was going to post the OGL version, right before the 1.2 deadline, and then once it's already posted, I'll just keep it under the OGL forever, and then move on to other stuff. But that went much better than I expected in the end. I wasn't sure if we were going to win that or not, but in the end, we won that in a way that's way more successful than I expected. And now, it's in the Creative Commons, and I view that as kind of the forever edition, right? They can do whatever they want. I can keep iterating on 5th edition in the Creative Commons version. And so, a lot of my stuff I intentionally release in the Creative Commons because I want other homebrewers to be able to use it. So, a lot of this, one of the problems that you have when doing third-party content or homebrew is that the SRD doesn't have that many spells in it, and particularly if you want spells for anything besides fire, right? If you want to make a cold sorcerer, right, you're not going to have many cold spells to put on their origin spell list or whatever. So I want to heavily expand the SRD, and that's what I call the KRD, the Kibbles reference document. And that's stuff that I want people to be able to use for whatever they want. That's not stealing my content. That's using it as intended if you put it in your document. And you can just copy paste the whole thing into you can just take all the spells and you can just put them in your document, and I don't care. This is also one of the things I like about Kickstarter, right? Because one of the stretch goals on my last Kickstarter was that I would put the whole book into the Creative Commons, because that Kickstarter did very well. And I said, if I'm going to make $400,000 on this Kickstarter, which the last one, that's what the last one raised, I've already been paid for this content, so I have no worries about it being repurposed or stolen or reused or anything like that, because the backers that are supporting it, right, they've already supported me. And any further money I'll get will be people that want it in the book copy. And no one's going to steal it and print it in a book. I can tell you, printing it in a book is way harder than writing it in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of thieves really run into problems like, it's harder for thieves than people think. And also for a lot of newbies, the problem is having something anybody wants to steal.
Right. There was, I'm not going to name names or anything, but, there was one streamer that was basically pretending to make my content. They had my content up on another screen while they were typing it on stream, saying they were coming up with it, right?
Oh, I can't imagine that went well.
Hours before someone was like, that's just KibblesTasty's content, So you're not going to hide where it came from for the most part. And by the time you do so much effort to disguise the content, right, it's not going to matter.
It made something new.
For people like that, right, your license doesn't matter, right? They don't go to your page. They don't read your license. If they wanted to steal it, they're just going to steal it.
Yeah.
So I figure, it's way better to be permissive with the people that are going to use your license and make it as easy as possible for them. They're the ones following their rules. And if they credit me in their document, that's almost certainly more sales for me, more eyes on my content, than trying to say, no, you have to come to my world to use my stuff. I would rather see, I like to see someone using one of my spells, like Ether Lance. If I see Ether Lance tagged with little K out in the wild, I'm thrilled with that.
Yeah.
I want there to be a bigger pool of these third-party stuff you can draw on, so that we're less dependent on the system reference document that Wizards puts out, because they are never going to add more content to that. They've had 10 years to consider it, and the only spell they ever added was Eldritch Blast because they realized they had to. They added
Because
like
otherwise you can't play a warlock.
they added like
Yeah.
5 more spells when they put out the 5.2, but we're not going to see heavy expansions of that. But this is something that we can just do. We can just put out more content at the Creative Commons, and then bam, it exists. And that's something that I kind of enjoy doing, because I tell people, if you're making a character builder, you're making a VTT or something, you can just take my content and put it in there. And the only things I generally encourage people not to do is do a secondary charge for only my content. So don't sell like a Kibbles pack on your VTT, but
Right.
you can include my content with the base version of it if you want, right? That's fine, A-okay with me. And I will probably be able to sell more stuff on that platform if they do that, because more people are gonna be like, oh, well, who's this KibblesTasty bloke? I will go look at him. I'll go give him money on Patreon. I'll back his next Kickstarter.
And somebody could like make a make an enemy wizard that uses like create pit or something.
Yeah, I mean, and I've had people make subclasses for my classes, right? And that's okay with me. That's great for me. The more people using my content in their stuff, the happier I am. And this is going to be the savvy part of it, I guess. I'm generally in this for the love of the game, in the sense that, like, if my goal was to make as much money as possible, I would not have quit my old job. So
Yeah.
I want people to use my content as much as possible. If people didn't use my content, I wouldn't make content, even if I made money doing it. I like hearing about people using my content, and the fact that people take stuff that I make and have fun playing D&D with it, that's kind of the whole point. So I'm here's the content. Take more content.
Well, and I really like that it's a CC buy as opposed to CC share alike buy, because it doesn't encumber the person down the road, other than credit where you got it, please.
Because one of the things I recognize is that some of this is easy for me to say because I don't really do lore stuff and things like that very much.
Right.
I mostly do mechanics, which, if we're being honest, most of those mechanics can't be super copyrighted anyway. So me saying, here's all my content is only so generous. It's just making your life easier, really. And so I don't want, if you use one spell for my content, I don't want to say your whole world's in, the open domain now because you gave a wizard create pit. I don't want there to be a trap card like that. Just take what you want and then share what you want.
I've used there's all sorts of problems and potential pitfalls, because I've used the example of like Sherlock Holmes's hat. Sherlock Holmes in the original books doesn't really get described as wearing a hat, but we all think of Sherlock Holmes as wearing the deerstalker. So you could have the problem of you invent the character, you release it under CC BY, somebody else does something iconic, and you've got the rights to the character, but not the thing that everyone thinks of with the character as a problem. And I'm still trying to figure out how to solve that properly for like the elf license so that you can say, to protect not just the mechanics, but also to help people for the other thing. But it's a thorny problem. It's not easy.
I mean, at the end of the day, I am kind of the opt-in sort of bloke where I am generally okay with saying, if I don't need to try to enforce what the downstream behavior is, because I think the people that do downstream behavior that are successful in doing it are probably going to be pretty open with their own content. The more kind of outside of corporations who have corporation logic, right? They live in a different world. But from independent creators, usually they're going to be pretty much the more they take from the open community, the more they give back to the open community. I'm not too worried about them just hoarding stuff in and kind of, making a hoard out of it. I'm sure some people will do that, but those aren't the people that I'm going to spend my time worrying about.
Yeah, and I mean, most people still have the problem of trying to get it to where somebody wants to steal your stuff.
Exactly. And I think that a lot of the time, I see some third parties or homebrewers that are just kind of a little bit conspiracy oriented about this kind of stuff. And, I often say, this is not your biggest worry. People that want to steal your content, either just take it for free or, pirate it or, plagiarize it, they're not going to care whatever your license is. They're not going to read your license. They've already stolen it. They've already, done whatever they wanted to do with it. The only people that are going to read your license are usually people that generally have fairly good intentions. So
yeah, you see this with like the board gaming community where somebody's like, I have an idea for a board game, but you can't know what it is until you until you sign this 12-page non-disclosure agreement. I had somebody wanted me to play test a board game they did at a board game thing, and they were like, but you have to sign this NDA. I'm like, I'm not signing that. And they're like, but you might steal my game.
yeah,
A, no, and B, like the effort it would take to steal is
that's kind of what I was talking about earlier, where a lot of the value any idea has is the combination of your reputation and that idea. So even if someone sees an alpha version of my class and they run out and make, their version of my class, I'm not super worried about that because most people that are coming to my, ecosystem want the KibblesTasty version of that class.
I mean, it's a lot easier if I'm going to a table to say, hey, I want to play something homebrew. It's a KibblesTasty product. And the DM will probably go, oh, I know who that is. Yeah, that's good to go. Just send me a copy or whatever. Like, I just want to look it over. But they're not going to be in the same sort of genre as if I went like, oh, yeah, I found it on D&D Wiki. They'll be like,
Yeah, so I mean, licenses are definitely important and permissions are important to an extent. But like in the layer that I work in, the sub kind of the sub corporate layer, reputation generally is going to be more important than your license.
yeah.
So that's why I have the luxury of not worrying about the details too much and just saying anyone can take my content for anything because I am large enough that if people larger than me take my content, they're probably going to suffer more reputation damage than they will get from using the content. And if people smaller than me take my content, maliciously, not just like using it as intended, then they're probably not going to have a meaningful impact on my ecosystem.
And they're probably just closing doors for themselves. Like, if I started being like, look at this cool homebrew I did, and it's the Summoner.
That streamer I mentioned that was copying my stuff, it did not end well for him. So, this has a way of working itself out.
Yeah, without naming names, I suspect they're probably not streaming, or at least if they are, that every time they try to say anything, it's people going, yeah, remember that time? So, yeah, people worry too much about this. I put out a little thing of like a dozen spells or something at one point for an extra life thing, just being on a pay what you want. And somebody was like, did you know somebody's stolen your stuff and has put it out online somewhere? And I was like, okay.
Yeah, I mean, there to an extent, like piracy is sort of a problem, but I figure that there's just not. This is kind of a different one from licenses because pirates don't care what your license is.
Yeah.
But I also figure, there's not much you're going to do about it. If you search on my PDF, sometimes the first result you'll get is the pirated version. And like that's just how it's going to be. But this is kind of why I like stuff like Patreon and Kickstarter, right? Because I've already been paid for this stuff. I've made my money. So if it's out there for free, that's not really any sweat off my brow.
Right.
Would it be nice if people paid for it? Sure. But the people that were going to pay for it are usually going to pay for it anyway because there a lot of people that come to like, my Patreon gives you very little you don't get for free. But people still come up and give me money because they're trying to give me money.
That's
and
the reputation
money
thing.
Any creator is going to be from people like that, where they're like, I want this thing to exist. I want this creator to have money, so I give them money. And
that's
that's
where
why.
the reputation thing comes in as well. Is you get people who see your free thing and then go buy it or go buy the next thing because they like you.
Mhm.
So
And also like the shiny new toy, right? You might get something that I make pirated in 6 months, but you're going to have to wait 6 months, and people are impatient, right? So that's kind of
right.
the several gates you have. You get the newest stuff, you get to interact with me directly, and it's the good feeling of supporting the person that makes it. And all those things kind of feed into why I don't super focus on piracy or licenses and stuff like that. I'd rather just, have the goodwill of just giving this stuff out to as many people as I can.
Well, I appreciate the heck out of that. What is your favorite non D&D system? I just gotta
Um, this I
if you.
actually have a pretty favorite answer. It's Lancer. There's a mech game called Lancer.
I don't think I've
It's
played that one, but it's now I'm curious.
Yeah, I would recommend it. So I can't play it with my normal D&D group because it's a bit crunchier. It's like a half step between war game and tabletop game, I'd say. And it has some things that aren't my favorite. Like as soon as you get out of the mechs, it becomes a bit too rules light for me, where it's a bit loose on how things work. And there's kind of this awkward transition to your pilot being in the mech and your out of mech experience.
I want to go buy some stuff with my salary or whatever.
It's a
Yeah,
really great kind of mix up with D&D, because D&D is a classic fantasy game, running around as a wizard and stuff, and then Lancer is this very sci-fi. It's not really hard sci-fi because it's got warp gate and stuff, but it's very esoteric sci-fi. It's very sci-fi. And it's just a really fun game. Got a lot of player modularity. It's got a great, website that you can kind of build stuff out on to look at it. So yeah, I'm in a Lancer game I play every week. I will probably be playing that either Saturday or Sunday.
awesome. And somebody's going to ask in the comments if they're not familiar with you. So um, I'm going to ask you a slightly offensive question just because somebody will ask otherwise and they'll be like, why didn't you ask this? How much AI goes into your products?
I use no AI in anything. I don't use AI writing. I don't use AI editing. I don't use AI art. I do kind of stay abreast of AI stuff for, I wouldn't call it professional curiosity, but I'd say like, seeing what the state of the world is. So I have gone to an AI and ask, write a D&D, subclass just to see what it can do. I know
It's a
because of that,
long
I
ways
happen
from
to know that old models of AI have ingested all of my content. I used with like the older version of OpenAI or ChatGPT, I used to be able to get it to say, like, if I would say, type out Kibbles this class, it used to just spit it back out. So I know that it ate all my content at one point. But I don't think that AI kind of stuff is creeping in, but I don't really think it's currently competitive with human created stuff.
yeah,
And then even if it was, I think that AI stuff is kind of radioactive in the TTRPG space for being
absolutely.
taken seriously. Um, and even like I view the biggest problem in AI right now as with AI art, because that has very aggressively creeped in, and I can see why, because you can go to AI art and you can generate something in 5 seconds, where if I go to my artist and say, here's my prompt to the artist, it's going to take at least 2 weeks. But because I work with a bunch of artists, even if was okay with AI in other ways, which I'm not really, I would have that same red line, because the artists are extremely against the AI art stuff.
My philosophy on that has always been not to use AI in any situation where I'd be taking money from from an artist. So I've got projects. Actually, I just got burned by an artist. I spent a whole bunch of money and the guy's vanished. But yeah, I'm working on some projects of my own, and the whole thing of like, all right, no AI, is going
Yeah.
to go in this, even though it might be a pain
So most of the artists I work with, I've been working with since before AI, so I'm not too worried about it. But one of the things I have to do now is I have to, say, give me like a speed drawing of your character work or steps of creation for any new artists I come up with, because at least once a week I get some pitch from an artist who wants me to commission them, and they want me to commission an AI. you know, there's a lot of problems with AI, but one of the problems is it's just kind of fed the grift mill. There's a lot
Yeah.
of people that as soon as you make something too easy to do, there's people that are going to try to leverage that for using it for the worst possible thing.
I
So
found the same thing where you try to hire an artist and you get somebody who looks really good, and then you're like, okay, but fix this, and they
I'm
can't.
very skeptical of what I would call generative AI, like LLMs, art generation stuff. I wouldn't go as far as saying that all uses of AI are terrible, but we got to address how this AI was trained on just stealing a bunch of arts kind of stuff. And I don't think people are going to be generally supportive of AI built products for the most part. You'll see that
Yeah.
sometimes you get a couple of sales, but you're going to have a lot harder time building up any sort of reputation, because as soon as you're using AI art, people are going to say, well, you're using AI writing. Because if you'd stooped to using AI art, well, why wouldn't you use AI for the text? And no one wants to pay for something that an AI spit out, because this is where we get back to the reputation. So even in a theoretical world where AI could do a good job, people generally aren't going to want the AutoGen 3000 version of a subclass. They're going to want the one that someone spent time thinking about, someone play tested, someone considered how it interacts with the game, stuff like that.
Yeah, it's AI isn't anywhere near it at this point. Like, I've occasionally used it for art and so forth. That dog, for instance, was a stock image of a dog that I was the stock artist got paid whatever the stock art of the service gets, and then doing some paint over with the AI. But it's just not possible to do with an artist, right? I couldn't.
Yeah,
For what I was doing, the artist just wouldn't have existed in that space, and I'm like, okay.
I don't personally use it for stuff like that, but I don't think there's any problem with people that use it for their games, like to generate NPC tokens and stuff like that.
Yeah, especially because what
I'm
it's
sure that
replacing is just straight up theft, usually.
regardless of my thoughts, right, that's going to happen one way or the other. So that's not where I'm going to sweat it. Where I start to have opinions is when it becomes into commercial products.
Yeah.
And maybe my opinions will evolve, or these kind of the market will change on that. But right now, I think that my opinion kind of lines up with the general community opinion, which is probably don't put it in commercial products.
Absolutely. And the reason why I ask it is because otherwise, like, I get somebody in the comments who goes, is his work AI? And it's like, I know it's not, but I want to make sure. So the main thing was just to get you to be like, yep, this is not an AI product.
I
this is a human crafted.
I have a no AI thing at the bottom of my Kickstarter. I think most Kickstarters these days have that. In my case, one of the artists offered to kind of do a time lapse of their drawings, just kind of show them drawing it, to show that the art, the art they did wasn't AI. So I kind of included that on the bottom of my Kickstarter with the little no AI tag. And
I hate that people have to do it now.
Yeah.
It's no, but I appreciate that too, because as much as I use some of it for things like character portraits and so forth, I am mindful and I don't want to put anybody like artists out of business and so forth. So I like that. Anything I should have asked that I haven't yet?
I mean, we've gone pretty long here. We've covered a lot of stuff. I can briefly talk about more stuff in the Kickstarter, just kind of to summarize, because we talked about airships a lot, but that's only half the title. There's also artifacts. So the
Absolutely.
other part, the other headliner of the book is artifacts, and the deal with these is like of artifacts in the game, and these cool things you never get because they come at level 20 or whatever. So what I want to do is artifacts the origin story, basically artifacts that you make and you kind of build as you level up. So they start as probably a non-magical sword or ring or something, And so the system that I'm bringing with the game is called Modular Crafting, which is the second crafting system I made that kind of integrates with the first one. And the way this one works is there's, it's kind of like if you've ever played a game like Path of Exile or something.
Yeah.
Or Diablo, I guess, where there's prefixes and suffixes to items. You could have like, a +1 sword of fire, right? And it would be a sword that adds +1 and does a little bit of fire damage. So that has a prefix modifier and a suffix modifier. So the difference between this and my previous crafting system, you could make a flame tongue weapon and it gave you a recipe for here's how to make a flame tongue weapon. This is the stuff you do. This one, there's no pre-built items. Instead, it's a list of here's the modifiers you can apply to a base item. So the items are generally weaker than the pre-made ones, but a lot more flexible. And then the difference is with an artifact is you can only have one artifact, and there's special rules for them. There's different forging techniques and all this stuff. But the root difference of artifacts is you can keep adding modifiers. Like every couple times you level up, you add another modifier. So this item becomes like this thing that grows with you, but it's also a resource sink, right? You need to stuff more magic stuff into this artifact. So it becomes, this oversized part of your magic item budget. And, not all characters are going to have them. So, maybe all, but they're not necessarily supposed to be something that everyone in the party needs to have.
Right.
So it kind of
it's an optional thing.
More and more of that character's resources as they kind of create this thing that's super important to them, this very specialized ring or sword or something. And, then the kind of narrative is, eventually your character dies or something. They leave this artifact in the world. And this is where artifacts come from.
It becomes the Sword of Casts, or
Exactly.
probably not the Hand of Vecna, but you get the idea for the next
started
one.
as just a +1 somewhat fancy longsword, but by the time you were 20th level, you've upgraded it to +2, you've upgraded to +3, you've put a wounding property on it. But every time you add more of these modifiers, then you also have to roll on these tables that have these, because artifacts have these minor benefits and minor drawbacks, right? So you get to pick the modifiers you add, and you always want to add cool stuff, but then you're also rolling these side effects. You keep trying to cram more magic into this item, and it starts to get, more and more unwieldy as strange properties arise from the fact that you've just enchanted this item like 6 times.
And I think that's one of the things that I've always kind of found somewhat frustrating sometimes. You want to play like a fighter who's got like, this is my legendary sword, and you're like, until I find the +2 version, and I have to throw out my,
That was kind of one of the flaws with the previous crafting system I made, and just loot in general, right? Is you would make an item, and then you would have an item, and then you would outgrow an item. So this system allows you to upgrade your item to keep making it better and cooler, and the artifact kind of are the purest expression of that, where you can just take it all the way up to this 20th level super item, as long as you keep grabbing more magical essences, or gold if you want to abstract it. It provides for both. Either you use the essence system from my previous crafting system, or you just use gold value if you're boring. So and what actually you talk about that. That's one of the things I accounted for, is that the item has to have a base price or what's called a base significance. So like magic. This is why magical swords tend to have all these gems and stuff on them, because they need to be a fancy sword. But as an alternative to the required base value, it can have a significance to your character. So if you've used this sword for like 5 levels, it becomes qualified as a base item. Or if this is the sword you inherited from your father or something, there's kind of a DM property that you work out with the DM. If this item, or if this was like the crown of a kingdom or something, even if it wouldn't be valuable, it has this ethereal significance to it. It allows it to be enchanted much further than a normal item.
And I mean, it's super cool. You could imagine somebody whose character is like the, this kingdom was destroyed, and your character is the last, last person of the noble family, and he's got the crown, which doesn't mean anything because the kingdom is destroyed, but he's trying to rebuild it and have that crown gain in significance and become a really powerful item as the campaign goes. That's
you can make your players really excited to get a rusty sword, because that rusty sword is the base for what's going to be a super cool artifact. That's one of the things I like about crafting in general, right, is it's so much easier to give loot when you can just give them like, an essence or something that has value to them. You don't have to constantly try to keep coming up with what does this player want. I mean, sometimes as a DM, you have a perfect idea, you give them a cool thing, they're super happy to get it. But it doesn't always make sense for killing a Hydra to drop a sword, right? Sometimes you want, to harvest kind of stuff from creatures, Hydras, whatever monsters that you want to then turn into valuable items. So you can kind of keep the progression step going, but also, give them tidbits as they go. So, you don't overflow them with loot, but you give them a clear progression path they can see and they can want something.
And I mean, the other thing is you can have the other thing as a DM, you create this item that the party finds that you think is going to be really cool. And the player's just like, not my thing, doesn't fit with my character. Whatever it is. I've had some items that I thought were really interesting that just kind of fell flat. And you're never going to get that with a player who's able to sort of take agency in what this item turns into because they chose it, right? I want it to be a wounding item now. Like, I'm adding that.
And this is the really modular part where some players do not care about crafting. Some players, they just want to find the cool sword. They are never going to engage with anything that has a table of mechanics. That's just going to go straight past them. But some players are going to latch onto this and get super excited. And that's kind of what I want to provide for. One of the reasons I picked artifacts was just because, there was something that almost never showed up in my game, right? I like the idea of artifacts, but, I don't go to the power level that justified giving them an artifact super often. So I was like, what if I can bring that concept of this, cool but somewhat warped item down to a reasonable level and let it grow with them as just kind of a way to expand this modular crafting system.
And I've also found the problem of you actually put in an artifact, like your party's level 15, you add an artifact and they're like, not touching that. We just, we leave that where it is.
It's a little bit sketchy, but if they've made the artifact, then it's their sketchy.
Exactly. It's, but like,
it was
party finds the hand of Vecna. They're just like,
the artifact might be, super dangerous, but if they're the one that made it super dangerous, they'll still be attached to it.
Yeah, they've got that emotional attachment, and I guess you can sort of lure them into it if there's that,
like, one step at a time,
Whereas if it's just like pick up the hand of Vecna right off, they're like, no, that can just sit in the dungeon. And you're like, but what if some orc finds it? It's like, yeah, okay, then we'll kill that orc. But it's I like that idea a lot. So yeah, I'm going to be getting my copy when they get shipped out. Where should people go to find you and find your stuff? Where's the best place?
The general kind of hub of everything I would point people to is my website. It's www.kthomebrew.com, but KibblesTasty.com also goes to the same place. So whichever is easy to remember for you. The main hubs of where I work are on my Patreon or my Discord, or currently the Kickstarter, but you can find all those on the website. The website also has almost everything I've ever made for free. So if that's kind of the hub location of stuff. You won't always get the fanciest, most upgraded version for free on the website, but there is probably over 500 pages of D&D stuff on that website, all free. And so that's kind of the central link hub. Go to the website and you can find the Discord, you can find the Patreon, you can find the current Kickstarter.
And there'll be some links below as well when this goes up. So
currently go to the Kickstarter.
Yes, we'll put that as the top link. Just go there first, folks, because good stuff. So thank you so much for joining me. I've had a lot of fun in this conversation. You've been very generous with your time. And yeah, thank you. I apologize if I fanboy a little because I'm a fan. So
thank you so much. Appreciate you having me on. I can't guarantee that I deliver my points concisely. I'm a bit of a rambling bloke, but I'm happy to talk about stuff.
That's my style too. So we're all good. All right. Thank you so much. And let's I'll hit the end recording button.